Okay, today we're learning Eruvin Daf Kaf Daled. Today's shiur is dedicated, sponsored by the Lobenberg family in honor of the yurtzeit of their father and grandfather Ralph Lobenberg, Rafael ben Mordechai Zichrono Livracha, who was able to be Mesayem Mesechet Eruvin 2 cycles ago, and also in honor of one of his granddaughters, Danya Gewurtz, who's continuing with her Daf Yomi learning with this third Mesechet as part of the new cycle. Saba would be so proud. Okay, we're going to start now with the end where we ended yesterday. I want to go back. Okay, so we're going to start about 10 lines from the bottom. We're going to explain that case better, and then we're going to get more in depth into it. And I actually put it at the top of the sheet again so you can visualize it and see what happened in the sugya. We started off with this halacha that a karpaf, I'm starting from the words karpaf, shehu yoter mi beit sa'atayim, you have an enclosed area that's more than the amount that's usually allowed. Okay, let's just review a little bit. A karpaf is, again, a big section. And number one, it's the issue of it's very big area. If you have walls around it, however, it all depends. It can be that large, and you can be allowed to carry in it under one major condition. It was what we call hukaf l'dira. That means you put up walls with the intent to live in that space. Okay, today we're going to get a lot more in depth into this, so I think you'll really get it by the end of class. So if you have a place that was more than the requisite amount that's allowed, it was more than a beit sa'atayim, more than 5,000 square amot, but yet you sectioned it off for a living. You had a huge mansion, okay, or a huge property, and around that property was a fence or some sort of boundary. You're great. You can carry in the whole thing. However, if at a certain point you decide that you want to plant the majority of this space, you want to use it for planting purposes, now already you're canceling out the fact that it was hukaf l'dira because you're planting there, and in the space where you plant, you will not be, right now we're going to see what happens. It's basically going to cancel out your whole hukaf l'dira because now we're in this enclosure that has a space that's nizra. But we're going to talk about different options here. So the Gemara says, if it was nizra rubo, if you planted in the majority of it, so that space becomes hareu kigina v'asur. That place becomes a gina, and it's forbidden to carry. Natarubo, and then we're going to see that it even cancels out the space next to it. It's going to depend on certain factors. So let's see. Natarubo, but if you planted trees, and we'll get back to that part later, trees generally, you can live among trees. You don't generally live among crops and a field that's planted like that. But you would live in a place where there's trees planted, and therefore it's like a chatzer or mutar. Okay, it's like a courtyard where someone can live, and therefore you didn't cancel its status of hukaf l'dira, that it was surrounded by mechitzot in order to live there. Now we're going to have the statement of Rav Huna. So this is the first version. We're going to have difficulty with this version, and therefore we're going to suggest two other possible versions. But according to this version, Am Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua, lo amaran ela yoter mi beit sa'atayim. It's only if the place where you planted was in a section that was more than beit sa'atayim, and then we're going to learn it's going to be forbidden, as I said maybe earlier, we'll talk about this, the entire space is going to be forbidden, not just the part where you planted, but the whole space you're not allowed to carry in. Why is this? We're going to see right now. Aval beit sa'atayim mutar. First, we're going to start with what's allowed, and then we're going to start with what's not allowed. If it's beit sa'atayim, then what happens? Meaning it's not more than beit sa'atayim. If that's the case, we're going to say it's allowed. Kiman, ki Rabbi Shimon. Ditnan, as Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon omer, echad gagod, echad chatzerot, echad karpifot, reshut echad lekelim sheshavtu b'tochan, v'lo lekelim sheshavtu b'toch habayit. We already learned this. So Rabbi Shimon says one can carry from all these spaces that are not generally major living spaces, but they're minor living spaces like roofs and karpifot and chatzerot and ginot, even if they're not exactly living, there are these exceptions to the regular spaces. One can carry from one to the other. So now, what do you have? You have these two sides. One, you didn't plant in. That's still considered a chatzer, a courtyard. The other space is now called a gina. Once it's more than beit sa'atayim, it's canceled out its previous status, and it now is no longer hukaf l'dira, but it now has the status of a garden. And it's a garden that's more than the requisite amount that's allowed. So at this point, what do we say? We have two areas. If it's less than beit sa'atayim, then it's not forbidden, because even if it wasn't hukaf l'dira, you could carry in this gina, because again, it has mechitzot, and it's less than 5,000 square amot. which means you now have a chatzer and a gina right next to each other. There's no wall between them. I mean, I drew it with a line in between, but that's just an imaginary line, right, in this picture. Since there's no boundary between them, this is what we call, each side is parutz bimlo'o. It's open in its entirety to another space. So now, again, if it's Beit Sa'atayim or less, 5,000 square amot or less, what do we say? One section is open to the other, but according to Rabbi Shimon, you can carry from one to the other. So therefore, it's not a case of, which we're going to learn a lot today, which we've talked about before, but we'll see it in a number of cases today. Parutz bimlo'o lemakom she'asur l'taltel bo. If something is open in its entirety to a space that one cannot carry from one to the other, then the whole space becomes forbidden. But this isn't that, because this is less than Beit Sa'atayim, and this is, right, and a gina that's less, or that is equal to or less than Beit Sa'atayim. The other is a chatzer. You can carry from one to the other according to Rabbi Shimon, so that works. But once it becomes more than Beit Sa'atayim, then you can no longer carry in there, even according to Rabbi Shimon. Then the chatzer is, the part that you didn't plant is open in its entirety to a space that you're not allowed to carry in, and therefore the whole section becomes forbidden. That's the way we understand it right now. I read it in one way, by the way. I noticed in the Schattenstein, they read it differently. When they say, Kiman ke Rabbi Shimon, it's already the beginning of a question. And it's saying, what are you saying this? According to Rabbi Shimon? And if so, we're going to ask the following question. Either which way, it means the same thing. Okay, you can either say the question starts there or the question starts here, either which way. But it says here, therefore, we're going to have the question though. Le Rabbi Shimon nami, now what they're basically saying is you're missing one basic point. Kevan dinizra rubo, we generally go by laws of rov, which means majority wins. So now what does this mean? Kevan dinizra rubo, have hahu miuta batil le legabe ruba. Even if, what did we start with? We started with the whole space is more than Beit Sa'atayim. But then we said, if the space where the planted area is either a Beit Sa'atayim or less, you can carry from one to the other according to Rabbi Shimon. But now they say, but Rabbi Shimon would agree that if that space is, let's say, a Beit Sa'atayim or less, and it's next to this area. Now, what did we say? It's nizra rubo, the majority of the space you planted. So as you see in the picture, right? I made a big rectangle and a smaller rectangle. That means that by laws of majority wins, the majority of this space is planted. That means that the chatzer that you left unplanted is nullified to the bigger space. So basically, this whole thing is really going to be judged as the entire space is really a karpaf shelo hukaf l'dira, right? It's now a karpaf, an enclosure, that even though it was hukaf l'dira, but you canceled the status of that because you started planting in the majority of it. So now this isn't really a place for living. So therefore, it can't be that that's what Rav Huna said. So we're now going to have two different versions of what Rav Huna said, and both of them start with the same premise. That Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua wasn't talking about when he said, when it's asur, that's only if it's this size or not. He's talking about an inference from the statement. The statement said, Nizra rubo asur. If you planted the majority, it would be forbidden. What's inferred from there? If you planted in the minority of the space and it was reversed, where the small space was planted and the larger space was not planted, it would be allowed, right? Because it's only a small area, so it's not going to be significant. So now we're going to say, so let's read it inside. If it's what was said, this is what was said. Hamiuta share, if you planted the minority of the space, it would be allowed. And then Amar Rav Huna. Now Rav Huna is going to comment on this minority. It's going to be two cases. Now imagine, you could have a huge space and the minority could still be quite large. The minority could still be a Beit Se'ah or more, we're going to see. So there's two different versions of exactly where the cutoff point is. So now comes Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua. So now we want to limit the fact that if you planted a small, not a small, I would say the minority of the space, percentage-wise, if less than 50% was planted space, then it would be allowed, but that's only going to be under certain conditions, size conditions. And that's going to be the debate between the two versions. So the first version says, that came Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua and he said, Lo amaran ela de lo have Beit Sa'atayim. It's only if it's less than Beit Sa'atayim. Aval Beit Sa'atayim asur. Keman kirabanan. Okay, now let's go back. Once it's more than Beit Sa'atayim, we already call that a Carmelite because what we remember, a karpaf, an enclosure that's not surrounded for the purposes of living, has the laws of a karmelit. A karmelit is, right, a big space that's not exactly Reshut Rabim, but it's also not exactly Reshut Yachid. It's not private or public, it's in between. And the rabbi said one cannot carry, just like you can't carry in the public domain more than 4 cubits, you also can't carry in a karmelit. Once we get to more than Beit Sa'atayim, we call it a karmelit, and then for sure it's going to be forbidden. But he says something interesting. He says, at the measurement of a Beit Sa'atayim, what did we want to say? We wanted to say, if you plant a small amount, or again, percentage-wise, you plant 48% or 49%, then it's the minority, and we're still going to count this as hukaf l'dira. Under the condition, comes Rav Huna, and he says that you didn't plant a Beit Sa'atayim exactly. If you planted exactly a Beit Sa'atayim, what happens? That becomes called a gina now. It can't. We can say laws of nullification work unless this actually goes back to laws of nullification, bitul b'shishim, right? Things are canceled out in 60. But there were some cases where we said, let's say a bug, right? Why are bugs so problematic in food? People go crazy, right, to clean strawberries and cauliflower and all that, because even though we say batel b'shishim, and if you cook, it'll be nullified in 60. If it's a bria, like a full creature, so you have a full bug or an ant or something like that in your food, that's forbidden because it has significance. Likewise here, if it's already a Beit Sa'atayim, that's already called a gina. You can't call that nullified to the rest of the chatzir. Even if it's only 20% of the space, it doesn't make a difference. It has enough space on its own that we can't nullify it. Now, what's the issue? Once we call it a gina, it's still Beit Sa'atayim. So that should be okay because one can carry in a karpaf that's Beit Sa'atayim or less. So this is okay. But what's the problem? If we hold like the rabbis against Rabbi Shimon, the rabbis don't think that you can carry from a chatzir to a gina. And now you have one side is a chatzir, one side is a gina. That's a classic case, according to the rabbis, of nifratz b'mlo'o. It's totally open to a space that's forbidden. So therefore, one cannot carry from one to the other, which means we now cancel out the entire space. You can't carry anywhere. That's what Rav Huna is coming to say. So what he's talking about is in a case where the planted part is the minority, yes, it's nullified to the other side under the condition that it's not a Beit Sa'atayim or more. If it's more, it'll be a karmelit, and for sure everyone would agree it's forbidden. But even at a Beit Sa'atayim, that already is called a gina. And once it's a gina, we now have gina and chatzir. There's no mechitza between them, so one, right, each is open to the other, and each can't carry to the other side, so the whole area becomes forbidden for carrying. That's the first version. Rav Yirmiyah midifti matni lakula. He's a little more lenient. Okay, you might say this is a very minor leniency. Okay, but he thinks it's not a Beit Sa'atayim that's going to be forbidden. He thinks it's more than a Beit Sa'atayim, right? We're talking about minor differences because it's either exactly a Beit Sa'atayim is going to be problematic according to the first one. He's going to think exactly Beit Sa'atayim is okay, but once you're more than 5,000 square amo, then it's going to be a problem. So he says, Matni lakula, how so? He starts it the same way. Ha-mi'uta shari. If it's the minority, it's allowed. That's the inference from the statement. Nizra rubo, it's going to be forbidden. But if it's the minority, it's okay. And then Amar Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yeshua lo amaran ela Beit Sa'atayim. If it's Beit Sa'atayim, it's going to be allowed. Now, why would this be allowed? We just said it's not. Again, we're going to say this is according to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon allows gina to chatzir. So even though it's a Beit Sa'atayim and we call it a gina, a garden, we don't care. A garden open to a courtyard, you can carry from one to the other according to Rabbi Shimon. So that's okay. But what's going to be a problem? Yoter mi Beit Sa'atayim asur, because it's going to be called a karmelit. Ve'keman ki Rabbi Shimon. And this follows Rabbi Shimon. Even Rabbi Shimon would agree. If it's open to a karmelit, well, a karmelit you can't carry. And the chatzir now is open fully into the karmelit. And therefore, one can't carry in the whole space. Okay? This is kind of an issue of semantics, right? How this space is the same space, it's just, it changes its status as it gets larger, right? Is it totally nullified to the chatzir because it's just a small space? Once it becomes even a minority, but a large amount, we already call it a gina. And then once it gets even larger than that, we call it a karmelit. So as it gets larger, it changes what it is exactly, what we call it. And then that affects the halacha, and then it all depends. Do you hold like the rabbis or Rabbi Shimon? So there were 3 versions of what Rav Huna actually said. Natahu bo. Now we're going to go back to the part about planting trees. If you planted trees in the majority of the space, hareu kechatzer mutar. This people can live among trees. That's all fine. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Ravimi, v'hu she'asuyin itztablaot. He limits this law, and he says it's only if you planted it in rows. If it's planted in rows, then people live among it. But if it's planted haphazardly, then that becomes like an orchard. And an orchard, nobody lives in an orchard, right? Think about it. Lots of people live with lots of trees in their backyard or in their space, but you don't. And now remember, there's walls around this space. This is all a case where it was hukaf l'dira, and then you started planting trees. So if you plant trees in neat rows, we're going to assume that you did it. You're still live among there. If you plant it all over the place in a random way, then people don't generally live. That's more defined as an orchard. Again, it's all a matter of how you define this kind of space. Rav Nachman Amar, he says, it doesn't matter how you plant them. Either which way, people live among trees, it's not a problem. Mar Yehuda, Ikla Lebe Rav Huna. Now we're going to have a case. He comes before Rav Huna Bar Yehuda. So Mar Yehuda appears in front of, he sees Rav Huna Bar Yehuda. Chazanu lahanu de lo avide itztablaot v'kamatal tele begavai. So he sees that he doesn't have these trees in these nice rows, and yet he's carrying there. So Amarle, so Mar Yehuda says to him, Lo savar lamar lahada avimi, don't you hold by avimi that it has to be itztablaot in order to allow you to carry, and yours are not? Amarle, Anakir Rav Nachman Sfirale, no, I hold like the other opinion, no problem. Okay, end of story. Basically just saying that one can hold like Rav Nachman and allow. Another halacha. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel, Karpaf yoter mi beit sa'atayim shelo hukaf l'dira. I have this big enclosure. I put machitzot up. I did, right? It's an enclosure. That obviously means I have machitzot, but I didn't do it for the purposes of living. But now I decide, maybe I get kicked out of my house. I don't know what. I decide I'm going to move in here and I want to live here. What's the problem? If I move in right now, I still have the problem that the walls that I put up then were not what we call hukaf l'dira. We take this very literally, hukaf l'dira. The walls have to be put up with the intent that I'm going to live there. So even though I've now decided I'm going to live there, in order to fix it, right, what we saw before was in order to cancel the status of hukaf l'dira, it doesn't take too much. You could plant it, right? That's already going to cancel the status. But to create a status of hukaf l'dira, you're going to need to do something much more. So this is a problem. What do I do with it? How do I fix it? I have to knock down a wall more than 10 amot. Remember, 10 amot is just an entrance. So it has to be that I cancel the mechitza. In order to cancel the mechitza, this goes back to the measurements we saw earlier in the Masechet. I have to knock down more than 10 amot. Once I do that, vigodro, then I fix the wall. And then, mamido al eser, right? I make sure the opening now is less than 10. And at this point, I have good mechitzot, and I now build those mechitzot. This is kind of like when you have a pergola, and you want to make your sukkah, and you want to use it as schach, but you have to build your schach once the walls are up, right? You can't have your schach there and then put your walls up. So if you have a pergola and you want to add walls, that doesn't count as kosher sukkah. But if you pick up, some people put in pergolas in a way that they can pick up the slats and put them back in. So that's like the same idea here, where then you're putting it in with the intent that it's, right, that it's going for your sukkah walls. So then it's working as schach. That works. So it's the same idea here. So you break the wall and then you rebuild it. Later, we're going to see that they had a situation where they couldn't break the wall, so then they tried to come up with something else. Also, it was not exactly the same situation as this, but we'll get back to that later. So now they say, what about Ibailu? So he asked the following question. They asked Rav Nachman, Paratz ama v'gadar ama, uparatz ama ugdara, ad shishlimo li yoter me'eser. What if I break, let's say, 1 cubit's worth of the wall, and then I rebuild it, and then I break the next section, and then I rebuild it? In other words, let's say you don't want to end up with ever a huge opening because all the animals are going to come through or something like that, right? You want to keep people out or animals out or whatever it is. So you don't want to break down your wall all at once, right? I was thinking sometimes if your window breaks, right, it's a big issue. You end up with this huge open space in your house. You don't want a window broken, right? Everything can come in. So likewise here, you don't want to break your wall all at once. So what do? You break a little section and you rebuild it. You break the next section, you rebuild it, you break the next section. All together, you end up that more than 10 amot were broken. But at every given point, you didn't ever have an opening of 10 amot. Now this, by the way, is very similar to something we saw in Masechet Shabbat on Daf Kuf Yubed. And in fact, that's what he's going to answer. Okay, so he says, Amar le, lav hainu ditnan. Isn't this what we learned? And now he's going to quote first the Mishnah in Kalim, then a question the Chizkiah asked Rabbi Yochanan, and based on this question on the Mishnah, and then the answer Rabbi Yochanan gave him, and Chizkiah's response, and from there we're going to get an answer to our question. So he says, isn't that what it said in the Mishnah? And then the ensuing discussion, ditnan. Kol klei ba'alei batim shiuran kerimonim. We've seen this many times. If you have a wooden utensil that's impure, when does it lose its status of impurity? Usually what happens is when it's broken. What's considered broken? When it has a hole the size of a rimon that a pomegranate could go through, which is obviously a big hole. So only once it has a big hole, otherwise we can assume you can still use it for other uses, and therefore it's not, right? It's only going to be a problem, and it's only going to be no longer a kli, if it's no longer a kli, right, at the size where the hole is bigger that a pomegranate will fall through. At that point, it's going to lose its tuma status. It's going to be called pure at that point because it's no longer a utensil at all. Now, here comes the question. Chizkiah asked, Nikev kemotzi zayit ustamo, v'chazar v'nikev kemotzi zayit ustamo, ad shishlimo lemotzei rimon mahu. What if you broke it, you made a hole, and only olives could fall through? That's obviously a lot smaller than a pomegranate. You fixed the hole. Then it got another hole nearby, and then you fixed it, and another, and another, and another, until altogether, all those holes would have been altogether the size of a pomegranate. But each one individually was fixed at the time, and you never ended up with a hole as big as the size of a pomegranate. So we asked that question to Rabbi Yochanan. Chizkiah asked it. Amar le Rabbi Yochanan, Rebbe, Shanita lanu. What do you mean? You, Chizkiah, taught this exact thing in a different case. And now, so we're basically, it's funny. They compared, if they wanted to know how do we have an answer to this question, they bring up a Mishnah, they bring up a question on the Mishnah, and then, which you think we're going to get the answer, but no, it's going to be, that's, right, we basically say this is like this, and this is like that. Okay, so we're going to have kind of three sections. There's three different cases here, and they're all basically the same. So Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan are only talking about two. We're going to say the comparison that he made is the exact same comparison by us. So now we go into the shoe, the sandal of a zav. A zav, if you remember, carries impurity. He has a level of impurity that if he steps or sits on something, and that's called tumat midras, if he steps on something, it's going to be tameh, and that object becomes what we call an avatuma. Normally, a person is metameh, an object, and it becomes a rishon, which means it can only pass on impurity to food and drink. But if you turn something into an av, which is what happens in tumat midras, the shoe becomes an av. The av can be betame a rishon, which means the av can be betame a person, utensils, and food and drink. So it's going to be a much higher level of impurity. So now he says to him, sandal. So he says, basically, Rabbi Yochanan says, Chizkiah, you taught us the following halacha. Sandal shenifsechka echat meoznav v'tikna. There's apparently two straps on the sides of a sandal. On either side, they're used as handles, like to hold the shoe or hold things into place. If one falls off, you still have the other one, and that still is considered a utensil. So if one of them breaks and you fixed it, tamei midras, it's still tamei midras because only one of them was broken, it was still usable. But nifseka shniya, if you already fixed the first, and then the second one broke, vitikna, and you fixed it, tahor mina midras, it's not tamei midras anymore. That shoe does not become an avatuma. Why? Because both of these handles were broken. At that point, again, only in the world of imagination, this was as if at some point, right, both of them were broken, even though at every given point, only one of them was broken. And it was actually at each point, so that's what we're going to read inside in a minute. But it's tamei maga midras. It's tamei as a rishon because it touched a midras, because earlier the whole thing was tamei before it broke. It was midras. So now it becomes like something that came in contact with the midras, and it's a rishon, but it's not an avatuma. Va'amart Allah, and you said to us, Maishna rishona dahakaima shniya. What's the difference between case A and case B? In case A, one ripped and the other one was still intact. In case B, where the second one ripped, shniya, nami hakaima rishona. The first one was still intact. So why would you differentiate between these cases? Va'amart lan Allah, and you yourself told us, panim chadashot ba'u lekan. you now end up with a brand new shoe that wasn't ever like it was originally because you fixed one and you fixed the other. So the two original straps are no longer here. So therefore, we view this as if it didn't have two straps at some given point in time, even though it was over, right? Even though it never really overlapped, but we view this as if it was no longer there. Likewise, we're going to say with our case, right? Hachanami, we could say by us, panim chadashot ba'u lekan. So first we learn back to the kli eitz, that likewise there we can say if all these holes altogether would add up to the size of a pomegranate, the kli would no longer be impure. And likewise by us, we're going to say the same thing, that in our case, we're going to say, since you knocked down this wall piece by piece, it doesn't matter that it was piece by piece. In the end, you broke more than 10 cubits worth. Therefore, it's considered a new wall that you now surrounded it, lidira, and therefore it's okay. Kari ale, when Rabbi Yochanan, and we saw this in Shabbat also, when Rabbi Yochanan answered Chizkiah, the answer to his question, quoting something that Chizkiah himself said, he says to Rabbi Yochanan, Kari ale, leitin bar inish. Wow, you are not human, right? This is what we say, you're superhuman, right? You are superhuman, it's amazing. Some people said, Kigon dim barnash. Wow, what a guy you are, okay? This is like we say, you're an amazing person. Okay, basically, not that you're not a person, you are a person. They both mean the same thing. It's just a different way of saying things. The same way we would say, wow, you're superhuman, or we might say you're a great person. So either which way, he was praising him for what he said. Okay, new case. Amar Rav Kahana, rechavash achorei habatim. Okay, now we're getting to a picture. We now have a house, picture number 140. We have a house. The backyard of the house, okay, we're going to learn their backyards were different. They're standard backyards. You notice this house has no door to the backyard. So we have this space behind the house. It's called a rechava, a big wide open space. And if you see in the picture, it has a wall. So now we say rechava, rechava she'achorei habatim ein metaltalim bo ela b'daled amot. If you notice, the picture says it's more than beit sa'atayim. If this space is more than beit sa'atayim, it's again a classic case of a large space surrounded by a wall, but not for living purposes. So therefore, you can't carry more than 4 amot. It's got the same status as a karmelit. Va'amar Rav Nachman, im patach lo petach mutar letaltel bekulo. So now he says, petach mitiro, right? So now the opening, if I make a door, this is picture number 141. If I make a door, and this is like our backyards, we have a door in the back of our houses. Generally, if someone has a backyard, it opens to the backyard space. If that's the case, then the backyard becomes a living space, as people know, right? Backyards generally people use for living. Maybe they don't sleep there, but they use it for all sorts of purposes that are like living purposes. So therefore it says, if there was a door open to the back, then it would be allowed. But now they're going to limit this a little bit. V'lo amaran ela shepatachu levasof hukaf. Remember, we talked about this before. It has to be hukaf ledira, which means the mechitzot have to be put up with the intent that one's going to live in the space. So therefore, this is only going to work if first the door existed to the backyard space, and then you put the wall up. Aval hukafu levasof patach. But if first you had the mechitza around the backyard, you didn't have an access route to the backyard from your house, and then levasof patach, right? And then you added a door, then lo. Okay, then it's not going to work because it wasn't hukaf ledira. So now they say, wait a minute. Patachu levasof hukaf. If first I had a door going to my backyard and then I put a wall up, pshita, that's totally obvious. Why do you even need to tell us that? Everybody knows that that's going to be part of your living space. That's your backyard. So they say, lo tzricha deipe beidrei. It's a case where you had there a silo or an area that you use for threshing. And then you might think that the only reason I opened it, I made an access way from my house and then put the borders around was because I wanted to access that, okay? But not that I was actually planning to live there. So maybe that's not called hukaf ledira. Kamash malan, that's why it comes to teach us, no. Any kind of enclosure that your house leads to is going to be considered for living purposes. Whether or not you have this beidrei or don't, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, we're not going to think that you're only going to use it for that. No, once you have a door and an access route, obviously you're going to use it for other things. Next case. Karpaf yoter mi beit sa'atayim shukaf ledira v'nitmale mayim. Let's say all of a sudden water comes into your space. Okay, right? We all know this. Lots of people have water issues in their house. So a flood comes, water fills up your area. So now the question is, and it seems like here, it's not just a flood or something, but there's this water that maybe is even here to stay. So now they say, Savur Rabbanan Lamemar Kizraim Damu. The rabbis thought that if you have this enclosure and it gets filled up with water, that now we're going to view this just like Nizra Rubo, just like you planted it. At this point, the water's filling the space. You can't live there if it's full of water. So therefore, it's no longer living space. V'asir. Now remember, every time we see this, Savur Rabbanan means they thought, which is always going to come with a rejection. They were wrong. The brother of Rav, and the son of Rav Misharshia. This isn't Rav that we normally know, because if it was, he wouldn't be quoting Rava. We're going to see. Okay, if he's the brother of Rav, they wouldn't be quoting Rava. Rav was first generation, Rava was fourth generation. It must be some other Rav. So he says, Hachi Amrina Mishmei de Rava. This is what they said in the name of Rava. Mayim kinitaim damu v'shari. Water is like trees, and it's allowed. Why is that? Because trees, right? People live among trees. People live among water. Water is actually useful. It's useful to have water going through. It's very easy to think about it. They didn't have running water. It's very convenient to water your fields, to drink, all that. But now we're going to have some limitations on this halacha of Rava. So Amar Meimar. So in this case, your karpaf gets full, your enclosure gets full of water. We're now going to say, right, again, it was a space that was hukaf ledira. You designated it for living space, but then it got full of water, which means you don't think maybe you're going to live there. But they say, no, since the water is usable for people living there, we call this use, okay, usable for living space. Amar Meimar, again, this is about canceling a status, right? To cancel the status, water in there is not enough. Meimar says, it's only if the water is usable water. If it's dirty or what's the word, contaminated water, then it wouldn't be. If it was contaminated, then it would actually cancel your status of hukaf ledira. Further, now Rav Ashi is going to limit what Meimar said. When it says it has to be worthy for use, again, what did Meimar say? As long as you're going to use the water, it's still considered surrounded for the purposes of living. Comes Rav Ashi and he says only if ein ba'omko yoter mibeit sa'atayim. This is going to be similar to what we saw in the beginning of class. Aval im yesh ba'omko yoter mibeit sa'atayim asur. Rav Ashi says if it's 10 tefachim deep and a space of more than beit sa'atayim that the water takes up, again, we're not going to say, oh, this is for use of whoever's in there. Once it becomes a beit sa'atayim, what happens? Again, status changes. What's a body of water 10 tefachim deep, more than a beit sa'atayim? That's what we call a karmelit. Remember we said all bodies of water, right? If they have those dimensions, they're more than 10 tefachim deep and more 10 handbreadths deep and more than a beit sa'atayim, 5,000 square amot, it's already called a karmelit. Once it becomes a karmelit, then we're back to our classic case. You now have a space that's enclosed, that's parutz bimlo'o, it's open in its entirety, to a space that's forbidden because it's a karmelit. So he says, if it becomes the size of a karmelit, no can do. Only if it's less, or a beit sa'atayim exactly, then it will be okay. But the Gemara rejects Rav Ashi, interestingly, and says, Vilav miltahi. It's not true what he says. Why? And he says something interesting, which I think could be understood in a few different ways. Midi dahava akarya de pere. It's like a pile of fruits. If you fill up a huge amount of space of your property with a pile of fruits, does that mean this is not a living space anymore? No, it doesn't mean that. It's just, now why is this? I think there's two reasons. One is, this I saw written, one is because you're basically, the fruits are there for your purposes. So therefore, just like, right, you can use the fruits. Likewise, the water, it doesn't matter how big a space it takes up. The water is there for your use and it's okay. But I think one can also view it a little differently. I think that when I thought about the water, what happens to water? It'll eventually dry up. You're not going to end up likely with this water forever in your property. So like the fruits, where they're not going to be there forever, you're going to end up eating them. So something that's impermanent can't cancel out what you designated already as living space. So since the water's there now, but it's like fruits that eventually will be eaten or used or dry up, Therefore, we're not going to say that this cancels your living space. Okay, so two possible explanations. Now we're getting to our final case, and for this, there's lots of pictures, so you can see, and if you look ahead, you can kind of see the development of each of the pictures. Each one kind of adds another thing. So we're going to talk about a particular case that happened. Hahu rechava, there was a rechava. Rechava is a big open space that nobody's living in. Dahavi b'pum nahara, it was in the place Pum Nahara. Pum Nahara really means on the banks of the river. We'll see why this place was called on the banks of the river, because it was right near the banks of the river. Dechad gisa hava patiach lemata. On one side of the rechava, and you can see in picture number 142. Okay, you see the street in the back. That's always in this book, they always do things by color, right? The water's obviously blue. The street's always black, like a paved, tar street. So the street is in the back. You have a little mavoy, okay, an alley with some houses, right, on the sides. That's your alley. The alley leads to the rechava. Rechava kind of looks like a chatzer. It's the other shape, right? It's not the same shape as a mavoy. It's big and wide. That leads into, I'll read it inside now. It was a rechava dehave b'pum nahara, the chagisa. So one side was open to the city. The chagisa, and the other side was patiach l'shvil shel kramim. From the other side of the rechava, you got to a small narrow path, kind of looks like a mavoy, with vineyards on both sides, so a narrow path. Ushvil shel kramim havasalik leguda denara. On the other side of that was a nahal. Okay, now you end up basically with a space that's enclosed on the side of the nahar, because generally the nahar, we assume, is 10 tfachim deep, which means it creates its own mechitza. And it's got a mavoy on the other side, which maybe you can fix. So the question is, can we fix this space and allow carrying? It's almost like we have an entire enclosed space, but with different statuses of parts throughout. So the question is, can we allow carrying within this space? Can we fix the mavoy? Can we fix the shvil? What can we do here? So, Amar Bai, Hechini Avid. Now, the simplest way, if we wanted to carry in this rechava, the rechava was not hukaf l'dira, it had a wall. So here the Mefarshim say it must be that it had a heavy stone wall that wasn't so easily breakable. Okay, and therefore they didn't suggest, let's break the wall of the rechava, encircle it for purposes of living, and then we'd allow the rechava. But right now, the problem is that we have a mavoy on one side. It opens up into the space that's problematic, because a rechava can't be carried in. It's more than beit satayim. And then that leads to the shvil of kramim. And the question is, are we allowed to carry in any of these spaces? And what can we do to fix it? So right now, we certainly can't. So we have to fix it in some way. So Abai suggests a few things that he rejects. And that's each picture is going to be in succession, each of the options. Then he's going to suggest something. Then Rav is going to say, I have a problem with your suggestion. And Rav is going to suggest his own. So Amar Abai, Hechini Avi, what can we do? Let's put up a wall on the side of the Nahal. Okay, basically we're going to put up a mechitza right here by the banks of the river. And then we can say, since the path of the kramim, of the vineyards, leads to the rechava, we can basically say, that's like putting a mechitza around the rechava for the purposes of living, and that would be okay. But he says, what's the problem? Ein osim mechitza gabe mechitza. There's already, remember we said this already, and you can see they built it like a wall here. The wall of the river, where it leads down to the river, since it's 10 tefachim deep, it creates its own wall. Which means if you want to lahakif something for the purposes of dira, you have to build a new mechitza. You can't build on the existing mechitza. So here there's already an existing mechitza. To put a mechitza over there at the corner isn't going to help you. So what's the second suggestion? Why don't we make something that functions like a wall, a tzurat petach, two lechis and a korah, a puma de shvil shel kramim, right at the entrance from the rechava to the shvil of kramim. We're now in picture number 144. Okay, we can put it right in between the rechava there. The tzurat petach functions like a mechitza. If it functions like a mechitza, we could basically say, here we basically made a mechitza and we've now surrounded it for the purposes of living space. But what does he say? That's not going to work either, because there's a problem you see in the picture. Atu gamle, camels are going to come. Now, why are camels going to walk through this shvil of kramim? Because there's a river there and they're going to want to go drink. So they're going to pass through here. And shagyan land, they're going to knock down the tzurat petach. Okay? Therefore, problem. Ella amar Abaye, so Abaye says, fine. We're worried they're going to knock down a tzurat petach because that's big. But maybe le'avid lechi. Maybe if you just put up one post right up against the wall, that won't necessarily be knocked down. It's interesting. A lechi you would think is less stable. But I guess they assume since it's on all three sides, if they knock down part, the whole thing will fall. So Maybe we're worried about the height of the Tzurat HaPetach. I'm not exactly sure. But in any case, he suggests, why don't we put up a lechi by the Shvil Shel Kramim? And migo de mahani, the Shvil Shel Kramim, mahane nami lerechava. What does he suggest? He says the Shvil of Kramim is like a mavoi. Why is it like a mavoi? A mavoi is an alley with 3 walls. This is an alley with 3 walls. It's a path. It has, now if you notice, they added in the picture that if you remember, in order to fix a mavoi, it has to have houses open to it. So they added to the picture houses. It would have to be that there's houses near the vineyards, and it's open. If you see here, I know you can't see necessarily from the video, but there's openings from the houses. In the middle of the shvil, there's these openings. So now we're going to say that if you have houses there and you have 2 walls on either side, right? The openings are obviously less than 10 amot, and you have a wall on the other side by the river. So it's 3 walls. 3 walls, you can put up a lechi, and that will fix the shvil shel kramim. And since it works as, now remember, lechi, we said many people think it's mishum mechitza. It kind of creates an imaginary mechitza. If it works, now where is this wall that you're building, this lechi, this imaginary wall? In between the rechava, the wide open space, and the path. So if it works to fix the path, we can assume it also works to fix the rechava. And it's as if you put up a wall for purposes of living. But Rava says, Amar le Rava, this isn't going to work. Yomru, people will have misconceived notions. They're going to think, lechi mo'il shvil shel kramim de alma. This is a unique path between kramim because it has a wall on the other side of the river. The river creates a wall. But if people see us do this, number one, they might not even see the river on the other side. And even if they do, they might just think, oh, you can use a lechi to fix a path, and a path normally is open on 2 sides, so it doesn't normally work. So therefore, or maybe it will be a path that doesn't have houses on it. So therefore, I don't like your solution because it's going to lead to people misunderstanding the halacha and thinking they can do other things. Therefore, El Amarava, let's come up with a different solution. Avdinan le, we're now up to number 145. We skipped 145. We already did that. We're up to number 146. In 146, they suggest, forget the shvil shel kramim. That's a problem according to Rava. But Avdina le'lechi lepitcha de mata. Put it on, now they call it the city, but it really means the mavoi. Now the assumption is, if you see here in the picture, they added a tzurat petach on the back side of the mavoi where it leads to the street, because this is really a mavoi mefulash. It's open on 2 sides. So if you put up a tzurat petach on the other side, and then on this side that leads to the rechava, you put up a lechi there, then we can say, just like Abaye tried to say with the other one, Demigo de mahan, so you make it on the petach of the mavoi leading to the rechava. Migo de mahane le lechi lamata, mahane nami le rechava. Since the lechi works there for the mavoi, because there it really can fix a mavoi. As long as you have a tzurat petach on the other side, this perfectly fixes the mavoi, which means that you've kind of built a wall. Since you built a wall, now you can say, oh, I built this wall for the rechava, to say it's now hukaf l'dira. So now they say, Hilkach, therefore, one can infer from Rava's suggestion that what? Tiltule b'mata gufa share, tiltule b'rechava gufa share. Where can you now carry for sure? You can carry within the mavoi, because you now created a perfect solution for a mavoi. It's got a tzurat petach on one side, a lechi on the other. And now you can carry within this rechava, because you basically built a mechitza, so to speak, that encircles it for dira. Normally this wouldn't work, but since your mechitza worked for the mavoi, and where did it work to create a mechitza? Right in between the 2, so therefore we allow it to work for the other. That's the whole logic here. But what about if you want to carry from the mavoi to the rechava? So they say, mimata the rechava, mi rechava lamata, plige barav acha v'ravina. They have a machloket about this. Chad asar v'chad shari. One allowed, one didn't. Man de shari, the one who allowed, says dehaleka diurin. What creates a problem to carry from a mavoi to the space? If there's people living in the rechava who aren't part of the mavoi, that would be a problem. But since nobody lives here, it's not a problem. So we basically say, since there's walls on the other side of the river, we can view this as if, once we fix the mavoi, which is leading to the public domain, we can view the rest as if it's all kind of encompassed, that the rechava is part of the mavoi, and therefore you can carry from there to there. But the other opinion says, man de asal, what are we worried about? Theoretically, someone could decide to live in this enclosed space, this rechava, since potentially someone could show up. And if somebody shows up and decides to just camp out there and live there, that would basically forbid carrying from the mavoi to here. And therefore, we can't allow it at all, because since there's potential for someone to come live there, therefore, it's going to be a problem. Because again, if someone doesn't join the shituf mavoot that they did in the mavoi, right, together with food and everything else, then it doesn't allow the mavoi. So therefore, don't allow any carrying just in case somebody comes to live there. This is, again, how much we have to worry about. Just in case something changes, do we have to forbid it now or not? It's a good question. It's good thoughts to think about. Okay, that's it for today. Have a great day, everyone.